Imagine the following case. A religious zealot witnesses a person who is flagrantly violating religious standards of behavior and acting in the name of God, goes and picks up the nearest available weapon and violently slays the sinner. And if this were to happen today, and it does, we would and we have been outraged, and we would call for this act to be condemned. So what then do we make of Pinchas, the focal point of the beginning of this week's Torah Parsha? Last week's Parsha, we know, ends with Pinchas taking the law into his own hands and killing a Jewish man and a Midianite woman engaged in immoral activity. But this week's Parsha begins with God commending Pinchas on this extraordinary act, Bikano et kinati betocham, the Torah tells us, when he zealously avenged my vengeance among them, and as an expression of his gratitude, God even goes as far as to grant Pinchas what's known as et briti shalom, my covenant of peace, and ultimately the covenant of eternal priesthood. Fanaticism, extremism, zealotry, intolerance, it seems from our Parsha to be praised and rewarded. And so is religious zealotry then, like we see with Pinchas, is this an ideal that needs to be emulated? Must we be more fanatical, be more extreme in our religious observance, our practice, our beliefs, and even our ideals? What's interesting, though, is that when we look throughout Tanakh, there's actually another famous character that also acts zealously on God's behalf, and that's Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu single-handedly challenges 450 priests of Baal on Mount Carmel to a showdown over who was the true representative of God, and then goes on to slaughter them when they are ultimately proven wrong. And afterwards, we see that Eliyahu goes off on his own and in a series of communications with God expressed himself actually in similar terminology to that which is used in our Parsha in relation to Pinchas. As Kano kinati laHashem Elokei tzvakot, I was moved by zeal for the Lord, the God of hosts, he says. But this time, interestingly, there is no gratitude, there's no praise, there's no reward from God. Instead, God tells him to, quote, go back by the way you came and go and anoint someone else, who we see to be Elisha, to succeed Eliyahu as prophet. And so both Pinchas and Eliyahu certainly act in a consistent and zealous manner. So how can we account for the difference in God's reaction? What is it about Pinchas' zealotry that brings forth God's praise and blessing, whereas Eliyahu receives a form of God's condemnation for his actions? And so perhaps we can suggest that the answer lies in recognizing the difference between the contexts in which both of these different events occur. You see, Pinchas lived during a time in which all Jews were committed to God and to Torah at the highest levels, and God's presence was palpable. And in such a society where immorality is an absolute aberration, perhaps a dramatic act of extremism, of fanaticism is necessary, maybe even appropriate and even commendable. But by contrast, the times in which Eliyahu, the times in which Elijah lived were very different. The majority of the Jewish people had become a primitive, idol-worshipping society, not feeling God's presence in their lives. And in such a world, what is necessary is specifically not zealotry and extremism. On the contrary, what is called for is calmness, sensitivity, gentleness, bridge building, and reconciliation. And I think that there's actually a beautiful proof to this idea of the differences between these time periods when we think about what happens to Pinchas many years after his heroic, zealous act. You see, we find that later in life, Pinchas becomes the embodiment of peace. In the book of Yoshua, when the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe, half the tribe of Menashe, when they return to the Transjordan and build a larger altar, the Jews prepare to wage war against them. They believe that these tribes have abandoned God, and Pinchas is sent to lead a delegation, and he brokers a peace, and he averts war. And what we see is that Pinchas has moved well beyond his zealous, uncompromising youth, and he ultimately becomes an elder statesman who pursues diplomacy and compromise and peace. And in fact, in the Gemara Zvachim, Rav Ashi is of the opinion that Pinchas never actually officially becomes a Kohen until he actually brokers this peace. His covenant of priesthood could only be realized when he realized his own internal covenant of peace. And so now, in a different time period, when the miracles, when the hand of God is not quite as clear, Pinchas knew and understood the proper way in which he had to lead. It wasn't with zealotry and extremism, but rather with a sense of calm and love and bridge building. And as we look around the world, it is pretty clear that we are living in a time period in which we need a lot less extremism and zealotry and more sensitivity and bridge building. From the current politics in our country on both the left and the right, to religious extremists, to leaders, to presidents using inappropriate language and rhetoric, it is certainly a challenging time. It is a time for more civility and less fanaticism. Now more than ever, we need the approach of Pinchas in his later years, where we are respectful, where we are kind, where we are understanding of those who are different than ourselves. We need to improve the tone of our debate and our conversations such that it leads to more discussion and less divisiveness. And as we've now entered into the time period known as the 3 weeks, as we count down to Tisha B'Av, to the 9th of Av, a time when we mourn the destruction of the temple, destroyed specifically due to our people's lack of civility to one another. Let us now, during this time period, redouble our efforts more than ever to show Ahavat Yisrael, to show love of our fellow Jews. Let us celebrate our differences and embody not the zealotry of Pinchas or Eliyahu, but rather the peace of Pinchas and the Brit Shalom of Hashem. And so Orit and Shaya and Nava and Noam, they join me in wishing you and your family a Shabbat Shalom.